Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles, framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation of Alexandria, Virginia.
As a lawmaker and as a deliberator, Madison, I think, had one great advantage that he drew on the basis of his experience. He understood that it was important to try to shape deliberations. He understood that in any legislative body, there might be people like themselves who really were activists in the best sense of the term, who really wanted to prepare and to shape and try to define the agenda from the outset. And then you have a number of ordinary lawmakers, many of them newcomers to the job or people somewhat less committed to the task than he was, who would really need to kind of wait to see how things were going to unfold. So I think on the basis of his experience, Madison understood the importance of trying to frame the agenda from the outset, and that's clearly what he did in Philadelphia. He started his preparations for that probably when he was back at Montpelier in the fall of 1786, or back in Virginia after the Annapolis Convention of September 1786. He had done a course of reading, and he started thinking about the basic problem of federal systems. But it was only in the early spring of 1786 that he starts to pull his agenda together, and he drafts a memorandum that he called the Vices of the Political System of the United States, and several letters to Jefferson, Edmund Randolph, and George Washington, which outlined his basic goals for Philadelphia. I think among those goals, I think the one that mattered most at the outset, that does the best job of explaining his agenda, was actually an insight he'd had back when he served in the Continental Congress in the early 1780s, and it had to do with the basic nature of the American federal system. Under the Article of Confederation, which in effect was the first federal constitution, drafted in 1776-77, ratified in 1781. Essentially, we had a system of what I call the voluntary compliance of the states. The Continental Congress would make recommendations, resolutions, requisitions states were supposed to fulfill, but the obligation and the responsibility of fulfilling them really fell to the states acting individually. The states were supposed to do what Congress asked them to do, but to figure out the best way to do it. It was, in a sense, a system of voluntary compliance. And Madison, first when he's serving in Congress, and then when he comes back to Philadelphia, when he's preparing for the convention, actually up in New York City in the spring of 1787, Madison thought really deeply about the nature of that federal system. And what he came to realize was that any system of federalism based upon the voluntary compliance of the states would never work. And he lays out a set of reasons, and it's actually item 7 in the Vices of the Political System. There's a single paragraph, which I think is actually analytically the most powerful paragraph in American political thinking that anyone has ever written, where he tries to explain why did the framers of the Articles of Confederation get this wrong at the beginning? Why did they not give Congress the power to enforce or the power to coerce the states into doing what they were supposed to do? Then he reflects on what have we learned since the Articles were drafted. And then he shifts into this, what we now recognize to be a very modern, we would actually say game theoretic mode of reasoning, where he says, comes rapid fire to 3 conclusions. He says, when states are differently situated, states will have different interests in the outcome of any decision. So you can't rely upon the universal compliance of all 13 states with federal measures. Then he says, within every state, you're likely to find what he calls courtiers of popularity. People will have their own political incentives to run against or to oppose requests coming from the national government. And then third, he says, and what I think is the most interesting point of all, is that even where the states have a latent disposition to agree on the outcome, to agree with the decision, if I doubt that you're going to comply, if I think on the basis of experience the others are not likely to comply, why should I go first? So even when we have a kind of latent agreement on issues, we're in a kind of situation where we're going to wait now to follow me after you. It's going to be more after you than follow me. So he says this will never fail to render federal measures abortive. Now, that's an insight into the nature of the Articles of Confederation. But what Madison does with this is to come up with an alternative system of government. If you can't rely upon the voluntary compliance of the states, what you need is actually a system of law in the full sense of the term. The national government has to be able to legislate, execute, and adjudicate its own decisions. Once you reach that point, once you say it has to act by law and not by recommendations and resolutions and the like, what you really need is a fully articulated government. You need a government that looks like a normal government. And its members, and then you can think about all the ways in which Americans have been experimenting with Republican governments, going back to 1776, going back to the decision for independence.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.